All right, so if you look in the Origins of Vietnam War packet, Activity 1, the first or the next thing to do is to watch Excerpt 1 of Vietnam, a Television History, which was a PBS miniseries in the 1970s. So let's get to it. And remember, you'll be taking notes.
Vietnam, a noble cause, a shameful venture. This television series looks back on a hard chapter in America's history. 2.5 million Americans fought in Vietnam, and 58,000 Americans died there.
It's a good first thing to jot down. 2.5 million Americans fought in the war, 58,000 died. That's the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., the National Mall.
Why? America's war in Vietnam lasted 15 years. But the Vietnamese have known war a long time, more than 2,000 years. Their traditional enemy was China.
Again, these are things you should be jotting down. So for Vietnam, the quest to become independent did not begin with France or the United States. It began 2,000 years earlier with China.
A giant neighbor to the north. For centuries, Vietnam was the southernmost part of China's empire. The Vietnamese absorbed Chinese culture and customs, but they never accepted Chinese rule. Today, throughout Vietnam, they commemorate the Trung sisters, who led a rebellion against China in the 1st century after Christ. The rebellion failed, but the Trung sisters are still heroines, part of a long line of Vietnamese who fought foreign domination.
Our history, from the time of the Hung Kings and the Trung sisters to the era of President Ho Chi Minh, has been a history of great struggle. Throughout history, the Vietnamese people have always done their best to defend the country and to build the nation.
They fought for almost 1,000 years after the Trungs to evict the Chinese. Then they pushed south to their present borders, conquering other peoples in their path. The country expanded so rapidly that it fragmented in a series of civil wars. Despite their internal conflicts, the Vietnamese regarded themselves as one country and one people.
And that's important to remember.
But they were too weak and divided to fight off the conquering Europeans in the 19th century. Around 1860, the French seized the area near Saigon.
That's the next thing you should jot down. 1860, the French step in.
They took over central and northern Vietnam during the next 2 decades, and by 1885, Vietnam had once again lost its independence.
So it took them 25 years, but they finally subdued Vietnam.
French Indochina at the end of the 1880s, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam.
So remember that because that will be on your test, maybe on a quiz even before then. Knowing that French Indochina is made up of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and knowing which one is which
the French divided into 3 regions, Cochin China, Annam, and Tonkin.
You don't really need to know these 3 regions. I mean, they're French made. The French broke it up into 3 regions to try and dissuade solidarity among the Vietnamese, making it more difficult for them to work together to try and expel the French. What you do need to remember is that Tonkin is the northernmost, because that will come into play in a later lesson, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. All right, so that would be, the Gulf of Tonkin would be right here, all right, to the east of the land.
To the Vietnamese, the division was a deliberate attempt to destroy their national unity. The Vietnamese resisted. The French called all resistors pirates, and they sent in the troops for the first pacification of Vietnam. They staged public executions. The severed heads were photographed and printed on postcards, which soldiers sent home to sweethearts in Paris with kisses from Hanoi.
So generally speaking, the French were pretty terrible to the Vietnamese. That's an understatement.
It took 20 years to get the Vietnamese resistance under control. Then the French could concentrate on the economics of colonialism, trying to transform Vietnam into a source of profit.
All right, 3 of the most abundant resources in Vietnam was tin, rubber, and what's called tungsten, used in lights in classrooms, as a matter of fact.
The people here suffered a lot because of high taxes and hard forced labor.
By the French.
They worked from dawn till dusk, but they did not have enough to eat.
The cheap labor profited a few French companies, even though Indochina was a financial sinkhole.
For France.
The French nation spent millions of francs each year to protect and support the colony, while French companies like Michelin Rubber made millions in profits from factories and plantations.
And again, that's the company Michelin, which still exists.
There were no major uprisings during these hard years. Vietnamese society was reeling under the impact of westernization. French culture permeated the cities, bringing Western fashions and ideas. The Vietnamese elite began to give their sons a Western education.
So the Vietnamese elite, for the most part, were kind of like collaborators with the French.
Almost all of those who would lead the next resistance to the French were French educated.
So they would send their children to France to become educated, and the children would return to Vietnam and become revolutionaries, like Ho Chi Minh.
Among them was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh's early years are difficult to trace. He was always mysterious about himself, giving few interviews.
And Ho Chi Minh was not his real name.
And preferring in later life to present himself as the benevolent Uncle Ho. Ho was born about 1890 as Nguyen Tat Tan.
So Nguyen Tat Tan was his real name.
The son
Nguyen is Nguyen.
of an official who resigned rather than serve under the French. As a young man, Ho left his country, working as a ship hand and cook in America, Britain, and France. In 1917, Ho moved to Paris. He took the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot.
So Nguyen Ai Quoc was his name, public name, when he went to the World War I negotiations, treaty negotiations at Versailles, and wasn't even allowed in the building.
And began to agitate for Vietnam's independence. He tried to plead his cause at the Versailles Conference following World War I, but was not admitted. His effort made him famous among the Vietnamese.
So remember, this was shortly after Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, in which he called for an end to colonization. But remember, in the end, only European colonies, white people, got their independence. And Woodrow Wilson was not willing to stick his neck out for non-white colonies.
France. In 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc became a founding member of the French Communist Party, the first Vietnamese communist. The communists sent him to Moscow for training in 1923. He traveled widely, organizing expatriate Vietnamese into a revolutionary party. Reports during the next 17 years placed him in Germany, China, Thailand, France, Russia. France was proud of its colonial record.
Dans de nombreuses régions, autrefois désertiques, où des tribus hostiles les unes aux autres traînaient une existence misérable, les civilisateurs français ont apporté la paix, le travail, la prospérité, la joie. Par son importance et sa fécondité, le domaine français d'outre-mer est devenu un élément essentiel de la vie économique mondiale, une force active de la civilisation, un glorieux témoignage de la grandeur de la France.
« 1940 brought the end of this grandeur of France.
World War II.
Japan, pursuing its conquest of China, wanted to block the transport of war material through Vietnam. In June 1940, 3 days after France fell to Nazi Germany, Japan demanded the right to land forces in Indochina.
So during World War II, it was this awkward situation where the French were still there. They didn't leave. They were still the lawmakers, so to speak. But the Japanese were there, and they had carte blanche just to use Vietnam as a staging point for whatever they wanted. And then you had the Vietnamese resistance, which began turning its attention toward World War II, toward the Nazis. Also, remember, Ho Chi Minh was our ally during World War II and was about to fight on our side right before the Pacific Theater ended.
Japan's arrival deeply impressed the Vietnamese. Asians like themselves had overthrown the European colonials.
And remember, that's how Japan initially framed their imperialism of China and French Indochina, that they were liberating them from the yoke of European control.
For it was clear who was in charge.
But very quickly, the liberators became the colonizers.
The Japanese supported several Vietnamese nationalist groups, but other groups were both anti-French and anti-Japanese.
And Ho Chi Minh's group is one of those that was anti-Japanese and anti-French. They were a nationalist group. They wanted independence.
The most important was the Viet Minh.
So it was either 40 or 41. You should jot this down. The Viet Minh, V-I-E-T space capital M-I-N-H. The Viet Minh was formed as a political group by Ho Chi Minh attempting to work towards Vietnamese independence from both France and Japan.
Founded in 1941 by Nguyen Ai Quoc. He had returned to Vietnam after 30 years with a new name, Ho Chi Minh, meaning he who enlightens.
After the conference to establish the Viet Minh, Uncle Ho sent out a letter calling for the support of the population. And it was this that rallied the entire country around the movement. And when people realized that Ho Chi Minh was actually Nguyen Ai Quoc, their trust in the movement was further established. This was because the name Nguyen Ai Quoc had been widely known in the country. People knew that he was a great patriot.
The Viet Minh organized guerrilla bases, trained cadres, harassed the French and Japanese, and spread propaganda, urging the peasants to resist.
Why did the Viet Minh fight the Japanese while other Asian nationalists collaborated?
I apologize, but this is a very funny question. At that time, the Japanese had already overthrown the French and begun to dominate our country.
So they had become the imperializers.
So of course we had to fight the Japanese.
By early 1945, Vietnam was suffering a terrible famine. People blamed the French and Japanese, who were hoarding rice, feeding it to Japanese troops, and even exporting it to Japan, while an estimated 2 million Vietnamese out of 8 million in the northern areas died.
Again, that's 1/4 the population.
Lên đến Hà Nội lúc bấy giờ đó, chúng tôi tính giờ là vào khoảng độ
At that time, in our estimate, at least 40,000 starving, poor peasants arrived in Hanoi to beg for food and to wait for handouts,
Hanoi was a big city in northern Vietnam.
for alms. The French did not organize any hunger relief, and the Japanese specifically forbade us to carry out any hunger relief effort of our own. People dug into the garbage dumps in order to find any edible thing at all. They also ate rats. But this was not enough to keep them alive.
The Viet Minh organized the peasants to seize rice stalks and gained tremendous prestige. This peasant support gave them a political edge they never lost.
So when the Vietnam War is in full effect, whether it's between the French and the Vietnamese or the U.S. and the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh will have 90% support among Vietnamese people. And things like helping them get food while they were starving went a long way towards getting that support.
It's a long, tough road to Tokyo. It's longer to go to Tokyo than it is to Berlin, in every sense of the word. The defeat of Germany will not mean the end of the war against Japan.
As the war in Europe drew to a close, Allied attention turned to Asia and the war against Japan. One of the pressing needs was intelligence.
Information about Japanese troop movements. And that's what was provided by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh.
The Viet Minh believed Allied statements supporting the rights of oppressed peoples. They had given the Allies information about Japanese troop movements. So the Americans turned to the Viet Minh and its leader, Ho Chi Minh.
I first met Ho on the China border between China and Indochina.
All right, so his name's pronounced Archimedes. It's a great name. And he was an OSS officer. Stands for the Office of Strategic Services. More or less, that's the precursor for the CIA. All right. So he would have been on the ground in Vietnam.
In the last days of April of 1945. He was quite an interesting individual, very sensitive, very gentle, a rather frail type. We spoke quite at length about the general situation, not only in Indochina, but the world at large.
We knew he was a communist, but we also felt, as they did, and the way anybody who has met Ho Chi Minh, that I've ever talked with, had the same feeling, he was first a nationalist and second a communist.
And that should be a note that you jot down, right? Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist before he was a communist. Now, as he will say, of course, he would prefer for Vietnam to be communist, but he would prefer to get their independence first. All right. In fact, when they finally do have elections up in North Vietnam, which was Ho Chi Minh's territory, they are open and free elections. All right. So this is the mistake that U.S. foreign policy decision makers made, right? They assumed that Ho Chi Minh was a puppet of Stalin, when in fact he was a fierce nationalist.
That is, he was interested in getting the independence of his people, and then he thought probably the best thing for them was the communist type of government. But he was a nationalist first and foremost.
The Viet Minh agreed to help the Allies. Major Patty sent a training group, the Deer Mission, into the northern mountains.
The Deer team went in and they organized out of about 500 Vietnamese. We selected, with the help of General Giap, selected 200. We spent the next 4 weeks training these young men into the art of using automatic weapons, demolition equipment, and the infiltrating and exfiltrating into various dangerous areas. There, for the first time, we saw what kind of troops the Viet Minh were. They were very willing, fine, young nationalists, really what we used to say gung-ho type. They were willing to risk their lives for their cause, the cause of independence against the French.
Before Ho's men could prove their willingness, World War II was over. The sudden Japanese collapse took many in French Indochina by surprise, but the Viet Minh were ready for what they called the August Revolution. Declaring Vietnam independent, they marched in to take Hanoi peacefully. Ho Chi Minh formed a government in Hanoi, carefully mixing in members of other nationalist groups. But in the south, away from Ho's moderating influence, his followers started purging rival nationalists.
So Ho Chi Minh had less control over what happened in more southern Vietnam. And that's where you saw more violence.
Still with the Viet Minh, and perhaps reinforcing the idea of American support, was the OSS.
2 or 3 days after I met Ho, he asked me to come in and stop in and see him, at which time he wanted to show me something. And what he wanted to show me was a draft of the Declaration of Independence that he was going to declare several days later. Of course, it was in Vietnamese and I couldn't read it, and when it was interpreted to me, I was quite taken aback to hear the words of the American Declaration of Independence. Words about liberty, and life, and the pursuit of happiness, etc. I just couldn't believe my own ears.
On September 2nd, 1945, on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered. And on the same day throughout Vietnam, the Vietnamese celebrated their self-proclaimed Independence Day and the formation of a new country, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
So please jot that down. So the nation that was formed by Ho Chi Minh after the Declaration of Independence was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV.
In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh read a speech that began, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights."
Vì vậy đó, đến khi mà Hồ Chủ tịch lên lễ đài đó,
I can say that the most moving moment was when President Ho Chi Minh climbed the steps
lần đầu
and the national anthem was sung.
quốc ca Việt Nam
It was the first time that the national anthem of Vietnam was sung in an official ceremony.
thế rồi bác
Uncle Ho then read the Declaration of Independence, which was a short document.
thế thì đang
As he was reading,
nói, thì bác
Uncle Ho stopped and asked,
đồng bào có nghe tôi nói
"Compatriots, can you hear me?"
đúng là cái câu ý nó rất
This
là
simple
đơn
question went into the hearts
giản.
of
Nó đi
everyone
vào
there.
trong lòng của quần
After
chúng
a moment
nhân
of silence,
dân.
they all shouted,
Sau
"Yes,
một phút im lặng,
we hear you."
thưa có thể nói là
And I can say that we did not just shout with our mouths, but with all our hearts. The hearts of over 400,000 people standing in the square then.
đứng ở xung quanh quảng trường. Trong khi mà bác
After Uncle Ho finished reading the Declaration of Independence,
thì có một cái máy bay nhỏ thôi.
an airplane, a small one, circled over us.
Cái quảng trường Ba Đình. Thì lúc giờ đồng bào chúng tôi là
We did not know whose plane it
không biết là
was.
máy bay gì. Tưởng là máy bay Việt Nam.
We thought that it was a Vietnamese plane.
Cái máy bay bay
But when it swooped down over us, we recognized the American flag.
thì đồng bào
The
cũng
crowd
rất là
cheered
vui vẻ,
enthusiastically.
phấn khởi mà
All right, and they cheered because they thought that the U.S. was going to support their Declaration of Independence.